Welcome to Going In Blind. I'm your host, Zach Tidwell. And my guest today is a retired police officer and hostage negotiator, in addition to being an author and speaker. Please welcome Scott Harvey. And to everyone at home, thank you for listening. Please take a second to help me grow the show so that I can keep delivering these conversations week after week for years to come. Subscribe, rate, and review the show in whatever podcasting app you're using right now, and check out the show notes to follow me on social media and YouTube as well. When you share your favorite episodes, tag me and use the hashtag GoingInBlind. You can also join my mailing list at zachtidwell.net. And if you know someone you think I should talk to, have them send me an email at contact.goinginblind@gmail.com. All right, Scott, I'm sure, I know this is a loaded question, but I would imagine this is going to lead us back before it leads us forward, like back in time. How does one find himself as a hostage negotiator?
That's a great lead-in question, Zach, and I don't know that anybody's ever asked me that. So here's my best answer off the top of my head. I'm a middle child of three brothers. So I grew up with two brothers. There was always fights. There was always issues. The older brother was never wrong about anything, still hasn't been wrong. The younger brother was like the family mascot. And as a middle-born, man, I was the peacekeeper. I was the negotiator. I was brokering deals all the time growing up. And we put the fun and dysfunction in our house growing up. Our parents divorced when I was young, and it was just the three of us and my mom trying to make things work. And so life got messy at times, but I became a pretty effective communicator as a teenager, just because that's kind of what life dealt me. And then when I got into law enforcement world, I thought it was to make the world safer for beautiful women, dogs, and babies. And I thought that's what the job was, man. And I realized very quickly that we were a cleanup deal. Like, we were called in when it had hit the fan, and we were tasked with putting things back together again. And I didn't like that. And so very early on in my law enforcement career, I got prevention focused. I got trained as a hostage negotiator. I was doing media relations for the department. I was teaching the DARE program in schools. I was supervising school resource officers as their sergeant. I just wanted to get upstream of all of the problems that law enforcement was dealing with and try to prevent those things, because cleanup is messy, and you never get back to a point where things are better than they were before whatever tragedy befell them. So I wanted to get up and teach people to make better choices. As a negotiator, I wanted to, regardless of how we got here, I want to help you make the next 5 minutes better than the last 5 minutes. Because when somebody gets on the phone with a hostage negotiator or a crisis negotiator, those terms are interchangeable, it's because the wheels have fallen off their life. It's because things are worse than they've ever been. And I could sit in judgment of how we got there, or I could decide we're going to make the next hour better than the last hour, and we're going to keep moving in that better direction. And I wasn't one who just wanted to come in guns blazing. That was never what I wanted to do. I would much rather talk you out of fighting. I tell people all the time on patrol, I can take you to the ground in a very nice way. I don't want to do that. I would much rather talk you into doing what I needed you to do, because then both of us leave that situation better. So I just became a communicator professionally wearing a police uniform, and that has kind of pivoted into what I'm doing today, now that I was able to retire from law enforcement. So that's a really long, roundabout answer to your very simple question, Zach, but sometimes I get going, I don't know when to stop.
And similarly, I don't know when to step in and pause people, because there's, a million things just came up along that path. But I told you beforehand, that's how these conversations go. So I'm going to step kind of back through these, I guess, a little bit. First of all, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say that I became a good communicator as a teenager. Like that, it's an interesting thought, but it makes sense when you lay out your family dynamics there. But it's, I get the question a lot when talking about my time in the military. Like there's a big assumption, I think, and naturally so, because there is an inclination for children to follow their parents' footsteps.
Mhm.
Was someone in your family a cop?
Actually, no. My older brother was in the fire service as a 18-ish-year-old, and he was a volunteer firefighter, and he was a cadet before that. So, like, he was exposed to that type of stuff, senior year in high school. And so I guess that may be where public safety kind of started for me. But I had done enough jobs as a teenager. I'd done some summer interns with some offices, some corporations, and enough jobs to realize what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to be behind a desk all day. I didn't want to be, at the end of the day, feeling like I didn't do anything that mattered. And so law enforcement kind of offered me the ability to help people in a way that I felt like I could do, and in a way that felt unique to me. I believe firmly not everybody's supposed to be in law enforcement. I've seen really, really good people become police officers and they just don't make it through because they can't flip that switch. They can't make the transition from being a really nice guy to being a potential liability because you don't keep a 6-foot gap between you and somebody that could potentially hurt you. All those things, really good bedside manner, not really safe in the law enforcement world because we do have to keep our guard up, like it or not. And so law enforcement was just my way of helping people for the 20 years that I did it. And I still continue that today, just not in a uniform.
Yeah, and I like h- hands down agree that not everyone should be a cop. It's
Yeah.
outside of the fact, like you touched on something very critical earlier that I don't think a lot of people consider. Like, yes, the cleanup crew thing, but a lot of times the police officers are interacting with people on the worst day of their lives, and it doesn't have to be so bad as a hostage situation, right? Like it's that's a you're kind of you're starting off at a disadvantage coming into that, right? People's emotions are high.
Yes.
Their adrenaline is rushing through their bodies. They're worked up about whatever's going on, or God forbid, you're stepping in after something horrendous has happened and not even being able to intervene before that happens. But that's outside of that, there's the physicality of it too. Like it's you have to the emotional and like intelligence and maturity there that requires to navigate those situations and flip that switch between, okay, like yes, I have to be the bad guy. Okay, now I need to go back to being the good guy. And okay, this is a sensitive thing for me because there's kids involved, but I have to turn that off for right now.
Yes.
And it's just the dynamic nature of it all and the requirements associated with that really is kind of it's uncanny. I mean, the only other thing that you can think of, I guess that's in a parallel to that is being in the military, right? If you're it's the
Yeah.
in those high stress situations, except cops are exposed to that every day.
Yeah,
Right.
and I was never military. A lot of respect for those of you that were and are. My son-in-law is in the Guard, and a lot of respect there. But I see a lot of similarities, as you touched, with law enforcement and the military. I just never served in the military, but I did do 20 years in law enforcement. And what people don't understand is that's why military careers and law enforcement careers aren't long because that stress is a real thing. The way that
Mm.
you're dealing with the public, the threat you're under, the fact that you're constantly a target, it's a real thing. When I was in law enforcement, it was 20-year retirement in Kentucky. It's now 25. That came about halfway through my career, but I was grandfathered in. 25 is about as long as I think you should go. Because they're kind of like dog years, man. They kind of age you a little bit. And it's funny. I just ran into a buddy of mine today in the Lowe's parking lot who has retired as well. And what he and I spent some time talking about is which therapist we found to be the best to deal with the 20 years of law enforcement work that we did. And I don't say that jokingly. I say that because we were trained that there were two types of people we're going to deal with: the non-compliant person and the potentially non-compliant person. And so that means even the person who's doing everything you ask them to do, that person is actually your biggest threat. Because a non-compliant person who's fighting you from the beginning, you know what to expect.
And your guard is
We're
already up.
Yes, and your guard is up, and the danger is, and what's unfortunate in law enforcement world is when you spend 20 years waiting for that sweet soccer mom to pull a gun and shoot you because she's done everything you've asked her to do up to this point, she's the potentially non-compliant person, you start treating every person that way, and then you have to really work against that. I was very cognizant to be friends with the people I worked with, but I didn't hang out with them outside of work. I had non-law enforcement friends because I needed that interaction. I needed some people who weren't going to be under the same stresses that I was under so that I could see other people in other professions deal with some things as well. And there's life outside of law enforcement.
Yeah, because otherwise, then it's even okay. Now we're talking about the bullshit at work, and oh yeah, like we may not be from the same department, but yeah, I had this happen, and that something
Yes.
very similar, and then it's you can never get that break, and that separation. I think is very important. That was I got married. I don't know, a couple years into the Marines, and like
Mhm.
that that was when I was able to move off base, and that getting to live off of base, go home, even if it was we'd just been in the field for a couple of weeks or whatever, but like you come home and it's yes, okay, I'm still in a town where there's a shitload of Marines, but I don't have to. It's not,
Right.
hey, work is right outside my door. Is
Yes.
it's just
Yes.
like this whole it changed everything in terms of like a mood where you're like, okay, I'm not just a grumpy ass all the time.
Well, because home is the safe place. Home is where
Yeah.
we let our guard down. And when you look at the psychology of it, like we have in the law enforcement world, what we call the hypervigilant roller coaster. So you're at work, you're hypervigilant all the time, and you're thinking of all the things you're going to do when you get home because you're in this state of euphoria almost because you're so hypervigilant. And then you get home and it's the safe place and you sit down in the magic recliner and nothing gets done because now I can drop my guard. Now I'm safe. Now I'm not under scrutiny or a target. And so you just want to surf channels all night. And that's that hypervigilant roller coaster that we still deal with in law enforcement. My kids still know. I've been retired for 7 years. My kids still know at a restaurant, dad is going to sit at the wall with his back to the wall facing the restaurant. And if you want to sit next to dad, you're going to sit on that side of the table. They've known that since they were toddlers. They're now 24 and 20. And sometimes they apologize. They're like, "Oh, wait, I'll switch you seats if you need." I'm like, "I don't need that seat anymore." Like, I'm trying to reprogram that part of my brain. I think we're good. But that's just ingrained in you, and that's when home becomes a safe place. Like you said, today, I kind of miss one of the things I miss about working from home largely today is that I don't have that drive home. I'm not coming home and taking off a uniform, and my mind doesn't really realize when I'm not at work because work is a home office now. And I don't have that closing routine that I used to have as a police officer where I would literally come home and take off the superhero costume and put on the dad costume or the husband costume and now working from home that's been a shift for me. I've had to make some conscious decisions of what the end of the day looks like for me and how do I know I'm home.
Yeah, there's no symbolic okay, yeah, like you said, I'm doffing the uniform and it's
Yes.
over. I
Yeah.
think that that awareness though, like it it does has to be or it does have to be nice to be able to turn off the okay, I'm always going to face the door and I'm always minding my P's and Q's on who's around me. But I think that's something that is important to keep in this and like a thing that people, outside of those environments who haven't been around people who have worked in a field like that don't realize like the people's lack of situational awareness is still like kind of mind-boggling to me just in
Mhm.
general, right? Like
Yes.
it just people don't know what's going on around them and it's leaves you open to be a victim of things and that's something I've had a hard time with that since I've lost my sight. Like I feel very vulnerable and that's especially because I lived in downtown Denver once I first got back out on my own,
Mhm.
moved into downtown Denver and I got into Brazilian jiu-jitsu because I was like, if someone tries to fuck with me,
Yep.
I'm going to strangle him. But like
Yes.
it's, I can still only be so aware of my surroundings, but
Right.
it's a weird that vulnerability isn't a fun feeling. Like the physical vulnerability
But I
is
would suspect in jujitsu, you may have an advantage because your body is so in tune to what physically is happening to it. You're not relying on your sight. It's more of an internal spidey sense type thing that people who can see may not key into. I think there might be when you're hands on in jujitsu, your eyes aren't doing a whole lot for you anyways. And I think that your other senses pick up and you pick up muscle movements probably quicker than a person who could see is what I'm guessing.
it's been interesting. I feel like it's zero, if not zero, like very, very minimal disadvantage once we're on the ground. Well,
Oh, I'm sure.
while we're
Yeah.
standing and I'm trying to get at somebody's legs. It's a little
Right.
rough, but
Sure. Sure.
yeah, once we're down, I mean, it's all by feel, and like if you're
Uh-huh.
doing it right, it should be by feel,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
interesting, and that's there's quite a few cops at my gym, and I
Mhm.
love that, like just
Mhm.
kind of tying back into that who should be an officer and that preparedness of it,
Mhm.
and I think obviously, yes, that keeps them safer. And like the dark side of me loves the idea of someone trying to get handsy with a cop and then just
Mhm.
getting put in a pretzel and getting their arm snapped or something. But
Yeah. Yeah.
like also, I think, and obviously this is from the outside looking in, but
Mhm.
I would imagine if you are a cop who is very capable on the ground and, you know, even if you have nothing else, if you're very capable on the ground, like I would imagine that confidence there probably carries over into you staying calmer in these situations where you do have to be on alert, but in being able to keep your cool and because you have that confidence of like, hey, okay, I can, barring I get shot, like if this comes hand to hand, I can handle myself. And I think that
Right.
probably decreases the chances of these the unfortunate incidences where we do see cops behave poorly that then, get kind of harped on and have, at least for a time there, kind of turned the public against law enforcement officers. It's,
Right.
the unfortunate reality is there's always going to be a bad apple in any group of people,
Sure.
whatever profession that
Yep.
is. But does that, I know there's basic combatives that, you guys go through in training in the
Mhm.
academy and stuff, but did you notice was it a trend in either direction for cops to train in some sort of martial art versus not?
Yeah, so I'll age myself a little bit. I started law enforcement in 98, and I retired in 2018. And I will say, over that 20 years, I saw a marked difference in the defensive tactics I learned in the academy
Mhm.
and the in-house tactics we were learning as I left. It was more ground combat in the 2000s, 2010s than it was in the 98s, in the late 90s, because in the late 90s it was striking. It
Yeah.
was, it was fluid shockwave principle, strike to the common peroneal with the leg. It was a lot of not kickboxing, but it was a lot of striking baton. And now they're realizing that most fights aren't that way. Most fights are a hot mess and you're in the middle of it and they're trying to get your gun or whatever, and you've got to be able to maneuver. And so I have seen officers that get involved in martial arts in MMA. That's fairly popular. Unfortunately, it's difficult for them to do that without public scrutiny and judgment, because it's one of the few professions where if you make somebody mad in public, they call the chief. If you
Oh,
if you're the Xerox salesman and you beat somebody in the ring, they don't call your boss at the Xerox company, right? They
yeah.
just they just don't, because they don't care. But now you're this public persona and you shouldn't be, beating people in the ring and that kind of stuff. And so I never got involved in that, but I did learn a lot from those guys that did and our defensive tactics instructors. Still to this day, at 50 years old, I'm pretty convinced I can get you unconscious in a few seconds if I can just get my hands on you. And that's all I really need. Like, I don't have to fight fair, but I will cut off that blood flow really quickly. You'll go unconscious, and then we'll deal with what we need to deal with. My problem with what we saw, let's in the George Floyd world, was there was never a de-escalation there. I feel like, once somebody is compliant, you sit them up and you turn to first aid. You guys did that in the military really well. Like, I'll shoot you, and then when you're subdued, then I will render first aid if I need to, right? If you require being put down, I'll put you down. But then when you're no longer a threat, now we move into life-saving tactics, which should have happened there. I feel very confident in my ability, like I said, to make somebody unconscious, but I also feel confident in my ability to restrain them and then render first aid at that point.
Yeah, and that's I wonder there because that cop fucked up, right? He should be in prison,
Sure,
and
sure.
that's unfortunately a bad apple. But it's like I would, and this isn't something I've thought about until right now, so I'm talking out of my ass. But and I wonder, like, okay, did he have training? Because I do find it hard to believe if he was trained that he'd just be sitting there with a knee on that guy's neck, which some of that was him just being an asshole, but it also may have been a lack of confidence in being able to handle himself. But I mean,
Could be.
he was completely subdued already, like you
Could
said.
be.
So
What bothered me the most about that, Zach, was the guy that just stood by, the other officer that just stood by and watched it happen. And that
yes,
really bothered me. I know it was a rookie officer, but still, what's wrong is wrong. And you need to say, hey, buddy, let's stand him up. Let's see if we can, de-escalate this situation. And I feel like those people in law enforcement are the exception. Unfortunately, there's people that benefit by parading those people out as the rule instead of the exception. And most cops I know, about every cop I hang out with, wants to be rid of those type people
yeah,
because they're a danger not only to the public, but to us. Because when somebody wearing the same uniform as me does something detrimental to the department, to the badge, then that makes me a bigger target than I should be, and I didn't do anything. So, we want rid of those people just like anybody else. So it's the lack of action on the bystanders that bothered me a lot in that video.
yeah. And I think most people, I would hope at least that most people realize that, and it's the it seems to me that things have started to swing back in the right direction. It's and that's in talking to the cops that I know and stuff, and in terms of the public perception and people realizing like, okay, that is again, those people are the exception, not
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
normality here.
That pendulum swings for sure, Zach. And I was fortunate enough to, I say fortunate in a weird way, to have worked through 9/11. So I was in law enforcement through 9/11 when police, fire, EMS became heroes for nothing that we did. I was nowhere near New York or the Pentagon or anything like that on September 11th. But to this day, there are businesses who every September 11th bring a cake or bring something to the police department to recognize officers. And we rode that wave for a year or more of being the heroes in America. And then, things changed and that pendulum swung back. I feel bad for the officers that started 2005, 2006, who never got to be the good guys, who have been the bad guys for a long time. And that pendulum hasn't swung back as far as it did during 9/11. But there are instances where it does swing back and we are the good guys for a short amount of time.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think we're probably on the cusp of something bad happening again in this country with where everything is right now, and where we know the different cells. I mean, in massive numbers of terrorist cells that are here in the United States and have come in the past several years. Like it's hopefully we don't get back to a point where there's that sweeping nationalism because of an attack, and like it can
Right.
get that
Right.
pride in our communities and things can come through something more innate. But like it's interesting you mentioned those some of those officers never getting to experience that because so I got out of the Marines in 2018, and I was married. I got married in 2016.
Mhm.
And my, I knew I was coming up on my time to decide, like, okay, am I going to reenlist or stay out? Because there's a lengthy process where you have to submit a package to reenlist, and you need to do that well ahead of your actual end of service. Otherwise, you can't reenlist. But
Right.
one of the things I was tossing out, a natural progression, especially from the infantry, is like, well, my job skills don't really apply to the civilian world except in law enforcement. And my ex-wife's, I think it was her uncle was a police officer, and he, she had conveyed that I was seriously considering that, and he passed the message along of like, you don't fucking want to be a cop right now.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
it's funny that our timelines kinda line up because I retired in 2018, and when 2020 rolled around with all of the civil unrest that we had between the pandemic and, the race riots and all of the things that were going on, my wife looked at me and she goes, "If you weren't retired right now, we'd be talking seriously about this situation. It was a great time to not be the police."
yeah,
When we were trying to figure out as a country how to be safe, and the police became the scapegoat for a lot of that stuff. And so it was a good time to not be the police, and I think we are swinging back a little bit right now, but not near where we need to. And you're not wrong about the sleeper cells. I'm not a guy who tends to carry off duty, but I carried the next day after we bombed Iran because you just never know. And I am trained and able to do that. And it's just those things that raise your threat level.
Yeah, and you know that's you having that is more like, and it's not just a protection of yourself. Like you're an asset. Like you know how to handle yourself in that situation. That's I hope that there's other officers and retired officers and you know former service members that are carrying out there, especially right now. You know, it might be shootings that occur, but it's also, I mean, obviously if it's a bombing, a gun's not going to do you any good. But just having, and that's a huge benefit of the Second Amendment in this country is just in times like this, like, and knowing that there's, okay, someone else in this store has something. Like,
Yeah.
it's,
Yep.
I don't know, we're in scary times, but I didn't mean to totally derail. And you know, I told you that these things
It's
meander,
all
but
good, man. We'll go
a-
where we need to.
as you know, I would imagine did you have to be a pretty senior officer before you started making that shift into like the steps into becoming a hostage negotiator, and can you speak to that and kind of lead into what the training was like?
Yeah, it was surprisingly early on in my career. Now, I worked for a relatively small agency. We're about 75 sworn, right outside of Lexington, Kentucky. So we are a bedroom suburb of Lexington. So we get all of Lexington's problems without, the scale that they have them. But I got into hostage negotiation fairly early on because thankfully my department is one of those departments where if you have the skill set, if you have the temperament, I should say, if you have the temperament, we'll teach you the skills. And so I was never the guy looking for a fight in the hostage negotiation world. When we would have an opening on the team, we would talk to officers and they're like, well, I can talk anybody into anything. And I'm like, that's probably not going to be super successful for you because as a negotiator, the number one tool is you have to be a good listener because I've never talked anybody into doing anything. I have listened people into doing what I want them to do. And that means I'm asking questions to find out what's important to them, what motivates them, what do they value, and then I craft a solution for them, whether it's a hostage taker or just somebody on patrol or one of my kids when they were little. Like I craft a solution that allows them to check as many win boxes as possible so that they will then do what I need them to do, thinking it's their idea and realizing that that's their best situation is that they do that. And so I had that skill set very early on in my law enforcement career, and it was recognized by the powers that be. I went to the training, I went through the interview process. Most of my training came through the FBI. The FBI is the guru when it comes to crisis negotiations. Chris Voss's book that is incredible called Never Split the Difference. He was one of the head FBI negotiators. I never trained with him. I trained with a couple other FBI negotiators, but those trainings were 40, 80 hours of, how to talk to people. And some of those were 6 to 8 hour scenario days where you're on the phone for, 6 or 8 hours at a time. And you're trying to talk somebody down who is another FBI agent who is, sometimes trying to mess with you and sometimes being more difficult than an actual person in crisis would be. But they were exhausting, but they paid huge dividends. And though I didn't do a ton of negotiating, at a official scene, I used those practices, those skills that I developed every day. I used them with the people that I was needing to arrest. I used them with family members who were in crisis. I used them in the DARE classroom teaching lessons to kids because good communication tactics transfer and make better humans. And better humans have better time with friends, better marriages, better kids, all of that stuff. So the negotiation stuff that I learned, I used more than once in an actual negotiation situation, but daily in my on work and off work time.
Well, that's pretty obvious because you've been married for almost 30 years. So
Yeah, yeah. She she keeps saying she's got me trained just how she wants me, which probably isn't far from the truth.
yeah.
But yeah, and it's one of those things where I think it's, once again, I touched early on in my story, my parents divorced when I was young, and my dad's dad, my grandfather, left my grandmother with 5 kids. My dad left my mom with 3 kids, and there was something inside of me that just realized, hey, this is something I can control. And I'm not going to repeat this cycle. In the law enforcement world, man, I saw cycles every day, cycles of abuse, cycles of neglect, cycles of poverty. Teenagers that their only career plan was to collect a check from the government because that's what had been modeled for them for generations. And so, unless you make a conscious decision otherwise, you oftentimes repeat even the dysfunctional parts of your upbringing. And so it was very conscious on my wife and I's part to say, hey, this is a job, the law enforcement job, because there's a high divorce rate in the police world, just like there is in the military. But I was asked when I interviewed for the police department before they hired me, they said, this is a job that's tough on marriages. You've been married a year or so. What are you going to do if this causes an issue between you and your wife? I said, well, I was looking for a job when I found this one, and I go and find another one because a marriage is forever and a job is temporary. And I was told by one of the interviewers that that's one of the reasons they hired me, was that answer to that question. And it's, I'm not blowing smoke. Like, that's more important to me than any job.
Yeah, and that's gosh, I guess that makes sense. I hadn't even thought about that you guys had started out in the super I mean, you guys were in your fledgling days as a couple when you got into this, which is kind of neat that you guys were able to navigate that together because that I mean, that had to be tumultuous. Obviously, it tends to be if they brought that up in your interview.
Yeah, yeah. We were married in 97, June of 97, and I started May of 98, so not even a year later. Now, she knew that that's what I had gone to college for. You don't have to go to college to be a police officer, but in Kentucky, you have to be 21, and you graduate high school at 18, so you might as well spend 3 or 4 years getting a degree, and that's what I did. But we were fortunate enough as part of my career is we got to go to the academy once we had been in 10, 12 years on the department, and we on their family days, and we got to talk to the spouses, the girlfriends, the husbands, that kind of stuff to say, hey, this job can wear on you. But one of the biggest things we told people was you can't just this macho stuff, and it could be macho male or female. I say that, with this machismo that says, well, I leave it at work. That's crap. You don't. You come home in a good mood or a bad mood. And if you are not telling your significant other why, they'll start filling in the blanks and they will be way more creative than what actually happened. And so the best thing I ever did is come home after a hard day. You mentioned the kids killed in a wreck or something like that. Like, you got a lot to unpack, is just come home and tell her. Because if you don't get it out, it tends to leak. We think we can put the lid on the box and stick it back on the shelf in our brain, but it starts leaking and infecting other areas of our life. And so I didn't get this perfect every time, but the times that I did come home and just kind of tell her what was going on without the kids around, the less problems I had with it.
Yeah, and that's something I feel I try and harp on, and I feel it's come up repeatedly in this show where, like, if you're struggling with something, even if it's an acute thing like that, like, you have to actually process it like that and communicate it, whatever, because
Yeah.
otherwise it does build up, and that will bleed over into other things in a negative way, and usually in a magnified having a magnified impact versus what it would have initially. But and I, I'm glad you mentioned your dad because I was curious with the way that you kind of introduced your family dynamic earlier, if that was the case, like if he had stepped out and it's I admire that you recognize that and broke the cycle. Like I had this conversation a couple months ago, but this episode just recently came out with a woman who used to work with specifically male teen sex offenders, and we talked about this because I go back and listen to a lot of these episodes to see where I can get better. Because I told you beforehand, I feel like I'm still really bad at running these. Like, as the host, it's a very different skill set than
Yeah.
going on someone else's show. But like it came up, a lot of these sex offenders, adult or child or teen, whatever, have often they are repeating what has been done to them. And that's like one of the things that we harped on then is like, yeah, but
Mhm.
that doesn't make it okay for you to do that. And so for you to have had the awareness as a young man and to have stuck with that is very admirable. So I
Well, I
just hope you're
appreciate
proud of
that.
that.
I think, and in law enforcement, I saw, unfortunately, part of the problems of law enforcement is we deal with the 5%ers, like the 5% people that are creating most of the problems is who we dealt with. And so it can skew your judgment. But like I said, I saw people choose not to love their kids. I saw people choose not to love their spouse by the way they handled them. And there's this misconception that love is a feeling, and it's not. It's a choice. And I watched my dad choose not to love my mom one day, and not to love us. And people in those type situations, and I've seen this a lot, it produces one of two people. Most of the time, it produces somebody who repeats the sins of the past generations. Occasionally, it produces somebody that swings so far the other direction, it's almost a psychosis. Like when I was in college, and this is going to sound dumb, but it's a real thing. Like if I went on a date with this new girl, I couldn't go out with another girl until I knew there wasn't going to be a second date with the first girl. Not that girls were lining up, Zach. I don't want to give you any misconception, but like my brain was so one person wired that I couldn't have different people dating at the same time because that was something that my subconscious wouldn't allow me to do. Once I knew that this girl was not into me or I was not into her and we moved on, then I could date somebody else. But it was so hardwired in me that I wasn't going to do that even at 19, 20 years old, that it honestly wasn't necessarily a choice.
Did that make it in your work hard to deal with? When I would imagine, a lot of these things you're referring to are domestic abuse and specifically men being bad spouses and bad parents or
Mhm.
just bad men. Like, did that make those, kind of tying back into earlier, like I was talking about, people having sensitivities to specific things. Did that make those situations like hard for you to be?
There there was one in particular, Zach, that I've talked about before. I don't care to talk about it now. It's public record, but I had a case when I was on patrol, and so it was in the first 6 years of my career because I spent 6 years on patrol before I moved into some administrative roles and into community services, teaching DARE, that type of stuff. But in my first 6 years, I got called to a house where a mom had wanted to report some abuse. So I get there, and she basically says, "Hey, I walked in on my husband, sexually assaulting our 5-year-old daughter." Well, at my
Oh,
house
fuck.
was 2 little girls, right? And so the dad in me, like, just wants to waylay this guy, right? Let me get my hands on him. And while she's telling me what happened, he walks through the door. I don't know the guy, but he just walks through the door and he says, "I'm not going to deny anything. I need some help. I've got a problem." So I said, "Well, I'm in the helping business." So I loaded him up in the car and I took him down and I did an interview with him that was all being recorded. And the worst part about it, Zach, is I had to talk him through basically, he waived his rights to an attorney, signed his Miranda waiver, everything was legal and above board. But I had to let him tell me and encourage him to tell me everything that he had ever done to his daughter. And the dad in me just wanted to come across the table at this guy. But the police officer in me knew the more he talks, the longer he's going to go away,
Because it's all
because it was all
evidence.
being recorded. So, I mean, you just want to take a bath afterwards. Like you just want to go and vomit after you've waylaid this guy, right? And he did plead guilty. He served 20 years in prison for what he did to his daughter, though she'll never be the same. But I needed him to keep talking. And that was probably the one that I just won't forget because, like I said, at my house was 2 little girls. Uh, and the one thing he said is, you know, she, she started touching herself at one point. He goes, "But I didn't show her that." And what I wanted to tell him is, "Yes, you did, because my little girls at home know what makes me happy." And that might be, smiling and dancing and singing. For you, it's sexual based. And she just wanted to make her dad happy. And
Jesus Christ.
I mean, that's the kind of stuff, Zach, that why you're in law enforcement for 20 years or 25 years. I didn't tell him that because I needed him to keep talking. I couldn't sit in a seat of judgment if he was going to keep talking. But that's what was the running dialogue in my head is she was trying to make her daddy happy in her dysfunctional way.
That is such a sickening thought. Like that's breaking it down to that.
Yeah.
And it makes sense. That totally makes sense. And like,
Because and we saw this all the time, it was these cycles are because that's their normal, right? I'm not sitting in judgment of these people who cycle abuse and cycle neglect because that's all they know. And I have removed kids from houses before that were in horrible shape, bugs, rats, feces everywhere, and the kids are traumatized because they're leaving home. Because as messed up as this is, it's still home and it's still safe and it's still mine. And those are the type things, that stick with you, that, you can't undo some of that stuff, but you can focus on making the next 5 minutes better than the last 5 minutes. And that involved, getting them out, getting the stuffed animal, talking to them about school, talking to them about things they were comfortable with so that it was less traumatic for them.
I can't imagine you having to sit across from this guy and not only listen to that, but I would imagine you're having like to intentionally stay almost friendly with him as you're doing,
Yeah.
like you said, because you need him to keep talking.
Yeah. And that's the only thing that got me through it is the longer you talk, the longer you're going to serve. And he said he needed help. Well, he got all the help our state penitentiary could give him for 20 years.
I'm sure
And I
the
don't.
other inmates probably helped him a little bit too.
They tend to help people like that. They have special places for people like that. So yeah, sorry to
That's
bring it down, man, but you asked.
no,
So here we
it's
are.
no, and I mean, that's like you said, I asked, I was curious, and it's just, it's, I mean, obviously we know that there's monsters out there, right? Everyone knows that, but you forget about it until, because it's not if you're fortunate enough to have a good life, like I have a good life, that's not an omnipresent thing that you're thinking about is like, there's these sick fucks out there doing that. And that's, there's a lot of kids and just people in general that are going through hell right now in this country, maybe in the house next door, and
Yeah.
you would never know.
But as many stories that are like that, Zach, there's 1,000 that are the opposite. There's 1,000 where this kid overcame difficult situations, where this family was dealt a horrible blow and they got stronger because of it and they got better. Or, the kids who we had people at the police department as I was leaving who were hired in as new officers who told me, "You were my dare officer in 5th grade." I'm like, well, you were
Wow.
10, and now you're not. But I had more than one of them say, this is part of why I'm here, is because, I saw you coming in and helping people. And those are the things that you hold on to more so than, the sick bastards that are out there that thankfully you had a hand in putting away.
Yeah. And that side of it is beautiful, right? Like
Yeah,
seeing the impact that you have. And I'm gonna make a hard transition here because I do want to make sure that I can ask you about the hostage
sure.
negotiation stuff.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, you had mentioned earlier, a lot of that training was with the FBI. Do they have a schoolhouse? Like, did your department send you to an FBI training school, or do they kind
So
of come around the country and do that stuff?
yeah, they kinda come around the country, but one of the first places I went was in Jacksonville, Florida, to a place called the Institute of Police Technology and Management. So it was just a training facility that the FBI came in an itinerant position, and these were retired agents who were working for IPTM, who were training negotiation. But I also went to our Louisville field office, just an hour and a half from my house here, and learned some media relations stuff from them, from the FBI, on how to deal with the media. I'd already done some media relations stuff, but we worked very closely with any agency that would offer some type of training. So we're required in the state of Kentucky, most people don't know this, to get 40 hours of training every year to maintain our certification. So if we don't, not only does it affect the individual officers, but the department can be in a whole lot of trouble if they don't maintain their 40 hours a year of required training, which I have a friend of mine who's a surgeon. He's a orthopedic surgeon. He's required less hours a year than police officers are. I think
That's
he told me
gross.
they were like 60 hours every 2 years. I'm like, dude, we have to have, you're cutting people open for a living, and we have to have more training. And yet the narrative is a bunch of untrained rednecks out here shooting people. That's
Especially
the
in
narrative.
Kentucky. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's the narrative.
You have department bullets and you're just out there.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Man, that's actually terrifying hearing that orthopedic
yeah.
surgeons, which, there's only so much time that you can pencil in for training, but that kind of seems like the profession where you should be doing it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's important.
A little bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in all, like how long was the schooling process for like for you to make that transition from a normal officer into a hostage negotiator?
So there's different levels, and I think I went through 3 different 40-hour trainings. So I had over 120 hours just in hostage negotiation. Now that also there's also other classes I took. Interview and interrogations comes to mind, which it's not technically hostage negotiations, but it's how to talk to people, which is very similar. And so I did a lot of different trainings like that. I wasn't a full-time negotiator, so we were on call just like our SWAT team was. So they
Oh,
worked
okay.
patrol, they worked as detectives. I worked in the community services division for most of my career. Um, but you were just on an on-call basis where if there was a crisis, we were notified, we responded 24/7. And like I said, they were few and far between, thankfully. But I negotiated on several occasions successfully because that's what we want to do. And that's how you build rapport with the person on the other end as a negotiator is they've got to realize you do actually want them to come out of this, right? You have to act, you can't fake that. You have to be really sincere. And so I saw it as a mental chess match where our number one priority was the citizens, and so immediately we would evacuate surrounding houses, surrounding apartments, that type of stuff. And then it's the bad guy or the people that are inside, excuse me, the people that are inside with them. And it's not often are there hostages. Most of the time, the reason we've kind of moved from hostage negotiator to crisis negotiator is most of the time it's some type of suicidal situation. That's just the world we live in. Even if they're caught in the middle of a crime, there's a potential suicide that you're dealing with here. Because I'm not going back to prison. My family can't deal with this, whatever. So it started as a hostage situation, but it ends as a barricaded. So I'm not coming out. You're not coming in. I'll kill myself first. And so we're talking to them, trying to stop that from happening. And then, after the people inside is the hostage taker is next, and then law enforcement is fourth on that list. Unfortunately, you hate to rank people, but that is when you get into law enforcement, you understand that risk. But as a negotiator, SWAT has the house surrounded. If he's telling me on the phone, hey, I can see that guy on the other side of my car, I'm radioing to our SWAT commander to say, hey, whoever's on the other side of the car needs to move. Because this in the military, line of sight is line of fire. And so if he wants to shoot from inside that house, he can see an officer. And so I would relay safety information back to them. One of the questions we would ask in a negotiation situation if they had weapons is we would try with everything in us to find out what they had. Because if they have a shotgun or a handgun, it's different than if they have a hunting rifle. The perimeter is very different. If you have a shotgun with double-aught buck, like as long as we're not in your house, we're pretty safe. But if you have an AR-15 or a hunting rifle, the perimeter needs to be spread out a little bit more. A handgun, same type situation. You can shoot a handgun accurately if you're good, 20 yards, right? And so it just changes where we put things. And so that was part of my job as a negotiator is to find out what type of weapons are we dealing with, and how stable is this individual?
Yeah, and because you had keyed at crisis negotiation a couple times earlier, and that's why I was curious, if that meant, hey, I'm calling because I'm standing on the Golden Gate Bridge, and like it's you're supposed to talk them off of that, but that's with a lot of hostage situations turning into that makes a lot of sense, and that hadn't even crossed my mind when trying to prepare for this conversation or
Hmm.
even this whole time that we've been talking, but it does. Like, fuck that. If you guys take me in, I'm going to prison for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Yeah. So it oftentimes turns into, or you'll have a time where there'll be a suicide discussion. And so, I got very adept at having those conversations. And contrary to what people believe, the best thing you can ask somebody you think is suicidal is, are you planning on killing yourself? That's a question you need to come right out and ask. If you have a friend in crisis, because what people are afraid of is, well, I don't want to plant the idea. That's not a thing, right? If you ask somebody, are you planning on killing yourself? They're not going to say, well, I wasn't until you suggested it. That's just not a thing. But if you call it out like that, it makes it okay for them to discuss.
And what, yeah, specifically directly like that. Like I talk
Yes.
about that all the time. Do you know how I lost my sight?
I do not know.
Okay. I shot myself in the head 6 years ago. So like
Okay.
I talk about that all the time where it's like,
Yeah.
you have to, and not in the sense that I'm saying like people miss it with me. I'm just, I think the warning signs that get talked about are a little inaccurate and like, but then people do ask a lot of times, like, what can you do? And it's a direct question like that.
Yes.
Like, hey, I've noticed these changes.
Yes.
I'm worried you're struggling. Are you going to hurt yourself? This is why I'm worried. But that's,
and even Zach, I'm going to push in a little bit to one thing
Yeah.
you said. Are you planning on hurting yourself? That's not a great question. A better question is, are you planning on killing yourself? Because to a guy like you and me, Zach, a bullet to the brain is not going to hurt, right? And so I can answer that honestly and say no. And I can blow enough smoke to maybe get you. But if you say, are you planning on killing yourself? If somebody says yes, the best follow-up question is, do you have a plan to do that? Because that gives you the sense of urgency. If they don't have a plan, we have a little bit more time. We still need to get the help train rolling right away, and you're with that person until the help train arrives. But if they have a plan, we're now in an emergency type situation. And you can ask them about that plan. You're not going to bring it to fruition, but the more you can make these things okay to talk about, the better we all are. And my struggle with the mental health situation in our world today, Zach, I shared this multiple times. I had my first panic attack in 2020. Thought I was having a heart attack. All of the sign, thought I was dying. Was at church at the time, and we go to a pretty big church. So I literally walked out and had the medical team check me because I'm like, I'm having a heart attack, right? And 2 weeks later, it happens again, sitting on my couch, watching a movie with my wife. My Apple Watch says my heart rate's at 145 beats a minute, just sitting on my couch, right? And this happened to be 6 months into COVID. And looking back on it, everything makes sense, where on March of 2020, 95% of my business income turned off like a faucet. I was earning my living as a professional speaker to large groups of people. And when we could no longer gather in large groups, my income turned off like a faucet. And so I say that to say what bothered me during that time is I spent 2-3 months feeling like I was broken and I didn't have my shit together and I couldn't control myself. And as a man, that was damaging. But as I told older men that I respected about what I was going through, they kind of smiled and they looked up and they're like, oh, I remember my first panic attack. And I'm like, you're freaking Yoda. Like when you look up Zen in the dictionary, you see your face, and I didn't know. And what bothered me is during COVID, everybody shared everything, right? I lost my sense of taste and smell. I spent a week on the couch. I had a fever. So we all had all this information coming at us all the time so that when we got COVID, because we all did, we understood this is normal. This is going to suck for a day, maybe a week, and then I'll move past it. When I had a panic attack, I didn't have that information. I thought I was the only one. Until I started doing the research and realized in a post-COVID world, like 85% of us were dealing with some type of anxiety or panic, but nobody was talking about it. And so I spent a lot of time today trying to normalize mental health discussions because had I known these guys that I super respected went through the same thing I did, I wouldn't have felt like I was broken. I would just felt like I did when I got COVID. I'm like, crap, it's my turn. This is going to suck, but there's another side to it because all these other people have walked this path before me. And I feel like if we can't fix anything we can't openly discuss, we have to have uncomfortable conversations today. I think we don't talk about mental health discussions in the normal workplace. We don't talk about race relations in polite America today. We don't talk about all of these things that have spiraled out of control in the last few years because somebody somewhere told us we shouldn't talk about them.
Yeah. And it's weird because then because that has propagated through, and what you said with the more direct, like, are you going to kill yourself, was a great point. I don't think I ever said that. Everything that you just said makes so much sense. I didn't want to leave that on the table and forget to
Yeah.
not like say like, yes, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Uh, but also like, with you touching on, I'm not the only one, and seeing that there is light at the end of the tunnel. I talk about that all the time with suicide. Like it's the same thing. It's
Yeah.
knowing that depression that feels inescapable is not inescapable because,
Right.
Bob got through it, whatever.
Right.
And these are the tools that you use to get through that and finding that light at the end of the tunnel. But like that's this having to tiptoe around things. It's a lot of things are off limits now. I almost said taboo, but I don't think that's right because
Right.
it's just, they're just off limits. And then if you do bring them up, then a lot of people probably out of this comfort of knowing the implications that has in their workplace, then it almost goes on a defensive. And so you can't have, hey, I know I'm getting into deep water here, but like I'm aware of it. I'm not trying to, let's talk about it. Like you usually can't even get to that point. It's if the subject comes up, then like you said,
I had a friend tell me this weekend, Zach, I don't want to interrupt, but he said, our ears are more sensitive than our hearts. And that stuck with me because, when you had mentioned earlier about jujitsu and not being able to see, I don't have a problem talking about that. I don't know you. We've never met before, but that's something you made okay to talk about when you mentioned it. And so in my experience, the more I tap dance around an obvious part of your life, the more awkward I make it when it doesn't have to be. That's just who Zach is. When somebody is telling me about their panic attacks or their anxiety, it doesn't have to be awkward. They've opened the door and given me permission to talk about it. And so let's talk. I don't know what it's like to deal with whatever you're dealing with until I ask. And so during the George Floyd Ahmaud Arbery days, I sought out my Black friends and had coffee with them on their back porch, sat at a Starbucks because I've never been Black before. I know you can't see me, Zach, but I'm not Black. And
you
I'm
do look Black to me actually right
well,
now. So
well, good to know.
yeah.
But when I reached out to them, I said, "Listen, I want to kind of understand this from your lens." And they said, "Scott, I've never been a police officer before. I've got questions for you too." And we had beautiful conversations because neither one of us was afraid to make it awkward or make it uncomfortable. We just asked. And if they said something I found offensive, I nicely let them know and explained why. And if I said something they found offensive because I didn't have their lived experience, they let me know and they explained to me why, and I learned. And what bothered me about those conversations, Zach, is that's the time that I had a podcast and I did an episode about these conversations. And I had more than one person tell me it was insensitive of me to talk to my friends about that and force them to be a representative of their race. And I'm like, they're my friends. And this is why you weren't invited to that conversation, because you emotionally can't handle it. And my point is, we have got to, in this country, have uncomfortable conversations. We've got to make that okay. And when I go into corporate America today and speak, I tell them all the time, if you're going to call a team member in to correct or coach or whatever, call it out in the beginning. This is going to be an uncomfortable conversation. You are not going to be fired. Let them know that in the beginning so they can listen to you differently, because we're all waiting for those words that you're fired when you get called into the boss's office. You're not going to be fired, but at the end of this conversation, I want us both to be better. And in order for that to happen, we have to have an awkward conversation. I'm not trying to offend you. I'm trying to make you better. And I'm trying to be better as a leader. So if you have any input on that, I'd love to hear it. And if you approach a conversation that way, you suck the awkward right out of it. And you just get better at the end of it.
Yeah. And, in an environment like that, that's more of because there's a hierarchy there, like it is more of a one-way thing. But if it is us, if it's us conversing and we want to get into something heavier that is generally like that society doesn't typically talk about, you and I enter that conversation, again, stating that it is going to be an uncomfortable thing. And then I think in that, like you said, with your friend, if I said something that offends you, me, or, if you said something that offends me, then me acknowledging that and stating it, but not escalating. It's that escalation where
Correct.
people then become combative, and then we get into the caveman, the back and forth, and it turns
Yes.
into, now I'm gonna go farther than you did. Now you're gonna go farther
Right.
than I did, and it's
One of the things I tell people, and I believe at my core, is ignorance is not malice. Just because I don't know doesn't mean I hate you. It just means I don't know. And I'm going to continue to not know until you tell me. So if I say something that you found offensive, that wasn't my intent. And I'll probably say it again if you don't correct me, right? Now, there is malice out there. There are people who are rude and disrespectful, but that's not me and that's not you, Zach. And so if you were to say something to me that I took in a different way, the most loving thing I can do is press into that and ask you about it. Where'd that come from? Why, here's how I heard that type of stuff. And that gives you a chance to say, well, that's not what I meant at all. But our interpretation is the other side of communication. And so I think we have to give each other permission for that. And you don't have those relationships with everybody. And contrary to what the world believes, those conversations don't happen on social media. They happen face to face with somebody when you can read the room. Because I tell people, when you are sitting across from somebody, I believe there are vibrations that we pick up on, and we can tell when they're not telling us everything, when they're hiding something, when they're guarded, when they're uncomfortable. And those are the things that we can ask about. I feel some tension here. If I've created that, that's not what I want to do. Please tell me how I can help.
yeah, and it's an interesting thing because you get that feeling with some people. Like, I feel like you and I could go into a hard conversation right now, and like we would be able to do that. And I don't know, I don't get that feeling with everyone, and I don't. So I'm
That's fair. Yeah.
yeah,
So I think it's worth asking somebody, hey, this is what I'm picking up on. Are you okay talking about this?
yeah,
And if they say no, then if that ever changes, you let me know. I'm here to help. You just leave that door open. You don't need to close it as you leave, because not everybody is capable of sharing all the things all the time, myself included. But if you were to say, hey, are you comfortable talking about this? I might say, give me a couple days and then I can, right? I need to process it first. And so those are things, especially in the workplace with friends, that type of stuff, that if there's no big red flags, you might be able to let that conversation wait. If there are some big red flags, it might be some time to ask some big questions, and let them know, I'm only asking you this because I care about you. If I didn't care, I'd let you do whatever you were planning on doing.
yeah. It's a very reasonable approach, and it makes them then feel safe, right? Like, that's
Mhm.
not coming at this from a bad, an adversarial spot here. Like,
Yeah. And as powerful as conversation is, Zach, sometimes it's just presence that makes the big difference. You can ask, and if they say, no, I don't want to talk about it, cool. That doesn't mean you leave. You just continue to hang out, because your presence there is comforting, and it shows that you care, even if they don't want to talk about it.
yeah, that's, yeah. I mean, silence is also powerful, and I know
Yeah.
we'll come back to the title of your book because I know that I wasn't trying to be slick there, but
No, that's
I
fair.
I want before, which is called Silence Kills.
Uh-huh.
But I want, before I forget, because I've been dying to ask this question. Then we got down a good leg of the conversation here. When in these scenarios, when you were coming in to hostage negotiate, how is that actual handoff conducted? Like, how are you introduced and injected into this situation where this person's, obviously a bank comes to mind, like,
Right,
where
right.
it's cliche, but
Sure. So
yeah,
it depends on how communication was established or if it was established. So I did a lot of my negotiating in the early 2000s. Cell phones were still in their infancy. They were disableable if we needed to. But if no communication was established, then I would get on the phone and call, or we could introduce a phone into the house. Our SWAT team had a armored phone that they could break a window and send it through the window, and we could make contact through that. So it's called a throw phone. So that was easiest if I was the first person they talked to. If patrol or a detective or somebody like that had already established contact, oftentimes what they would say is, hey, Scott is here, and Scott's job is to help you. He's better equipped. I've got other things I need to do. So, Scott's going to take care of you. And so it was very easy. You just didn't make it a big deal because oftentimes people will cue from us. So if we make it a big deal, they'll make it a big deal. The best illustration I can give is to the parents that are listening. If your kid has ever broken a bone or had some type of serious injury, as long as you don't freak out, they'll stay calm. And it doesn't even have to be a big injury. Like if a kid just falls down and you start laughing and you're like, look at you. Or if you suck all the air out of the room, then they're going to start crying because you're freaked
Yeah.
out. So they cue off of us. Mirror neurons are real, even with babies. That's why babies mimic our face. And so if you are managing your stress and keeping things under control, then they will too. And as a parent, if you've had an emergency, generally you'll hand them over to the doctor and then you can go in the waiting room and lose your crap, right? But in front of the child, they need to know that we've got this and we can handle this. So as a negotiator, if it's not a big deal to you, there's a good chance it won't be a big deal to them either.
It makes sense. I mean, it's it's hard, like, from me not having any experience with that, thinking of like, okay, yeah, you treat this adult in a hostage situation just like you would treat a child in the sense that like you're trying to play cool, but it
Yeah,
makes it so much more, I guess, simple than you would think in terms of the thought process. Is not like doing it and actually making this happen and navigating that successfully is simple, but I'm kind of flabbergasted right now that that's like how you go into that. And that's, I mean, from there, it's literally just you're making deals to hopefully come to a desirable, an outcome where nobody dies.
right,
And
right.
okay.
Yeah, that's the win is everybody comes out of this. And, a lot of times that involved me telling them, hey, once you're taken into custody by the SWAT team, I will come face to face and talk to you. I will come and meet you and I'll go to the hospital with you if that's where you're going. Like, because what people don't realize is people who find themselves in these situations, hostage takers or in crisis, they have a high level of recidivism, which means they're likely to do this again. We could probably say they're poor decision makers. That's how they got here. And because it worked out successfully, they weren't hurt, they weren't killed, the chances of them doing it again actually goes up. And so if I make them any kind of promises, like I need to keep those promises because if it's not me on the phone next time, it'll be somebody else and they'll be like, that last asshole lied to me. He said he was going to meet me and he never met me. I came out, did what he told me to do, and he didn't do what he was going to do. So we've got to keep our word and do what we say we're going to do in these negotiation situations because you set yourself up for failure the next time if you don't.
Did you yourself, and I would imagine that this is in terms of strictly crisis scenarios, there is reasonably high recidivism in the sense that, a lot of that, if someone's at that point where they're making a public display of it, they are trying to get help and they might think that they want to die, but I don't think they truly want to die
Yep.
because that is you asking for help. And so if you have asked for help, gotten the help, and then not done the work to correct whatever deficiency led you there, then now you're back in this state where, okay, I'm going to ask for help again. But didn't, I'm guessing you saw some repeat customers there, but did you actually see recidivism yourself in encountering the same people and who held hostages?
Not in a hostage situation, but we did have people that we arrested almost every weekend for either DUI, alcohol intoxication, sometimes minor abuse, fighting, that type of stuff. And even those people, like if you treat them with respect, and as I said earlier, I can respectfully take you to the ground, right? I don't have to be a jerk about it. And as soon as you straighten up, I will stand you back up and we will move on with life, right? Uh, and as long as you're respectful in your dealings with them, the next time you deal with them is different. They might still fight, but they realize, Scott's not going to treat me like a jerk. Scott's not going to be disrespectful to me. So it's actually not a lot of fun to be disrespectful to him. So, if I don't give them the fight that they want, they will generally de-escalate. That was one of the things that I tried to do a lot was de-escalate every situation. If somebody's yelling at me on patrol, I talk quieter back to them. Not in a patronizing way, but in a way to try to level them out. Because the most valuable thing I ever learned as a negotiator, Zach, is in our brain, everybody's brain is a teeter-totter. And on one end of that teeter-totter is emotion. I don't care what the emotion is, fear, anger, frustration, depression, whatever. On the other end of that teeter-totter is logic and reason. So when emotions go up, the other end of that teeter-totter, logic and reason go down. So you're actually not capable of making logical decisions under high emotion. This is why we've all made emotional decisions and a few hours later tried to justify it, because now the teeter-totter is starting to right itself. The emotions are coming down, logic and reason are coming back in, and they're trying to make sense of the emotional decision we made, right? And we all do it. And so when I got on the phone with somebody who was in crisis, they yelled at me, they threatened my family, and then they would hang up and I'd call them back. And they'd yell at me, they'd threaten me. I needed them to vent, because the more they vented, the more that emotion would start coming down. As long as I kept control of my anger, their emotions would start coming down and logic and reason would start to return to the conversation. So when somebody, is dealing with depression or something like that, logic and reason are not part of the equation. It's just not.
Yeah.
Best thing we can do is let them talk. That's why we ask these people questions. We want them to talk, because the longer they talk, the more that emotion comes down and the more logic and reason will start to return. You can offer, if your spouse or significant other comes home and starts venting about their day at work, and now you're mad at Brittany and you've never even met Brittany before. But if you can keep control of your teeter-totter, if you'll offer them a logical solution to their conflict with Brittany, and they'll blow right past it. And a couple hours later, they'll come to you with that solution as if it were their own. Because when their teeter-totter rights itself, their subconscious mind picked up on what you said. They just couldn't process it because of the high emotion. When the emotions come down and logic and reason come back, you're like, yeah, okay, I think this is what I'm going to do. And that's what they say to you. And you're like, I think that's a great idea. You resist the urge to say, that's what I told you 2 hours ago, right? Because that's not helpful. And that's how you get them emotional again, right? Is you say, I told you so. But it's fascinating when you understand the brain. Under high emotion, it cannot process logic and reason. So you have to deal with the emotion before you can deal with logic and reason.
It's so, I mean, it's fascinating, and it makes sense. And like, that's just, but that, like what you said, you're like, and that's how you get them emotional again. It's so true. Like, it just is people.
I
It
mean,
is so true.
I knew very early on in my law enforcement career, I can talk you out of fighting, but I can talk you into fighting as well, right? My words are powerful. Your words are powerful. People respond to those things, and you can mess with people's teeter-totters for the wrong reason. You can get them emotional for the wrong reason, or you can get them emotion or take some emotion out so that you can best help them.
Just, it's interesting. I'm gonna just have a lot to think about. I feel like
And let me
have
blow your mind a
done
little bit
this.
more, Zach,
Yeah.
because I just read this the other day in a book, because I nerd out on this stuff. There's a part of the brain called Broca's area. I may be saying that wrong, but it's basically under stress. They pull oxygen from this area in your brain. They've done brain scans on this. They pull oxygen from this area, and that's the part of your brain responsible for forming sentences.
It's
That's
literally
why
less
under
capable.
high stress, when you experience a high stress thing, you really can't tell somebody about it. Because in the moment, you almost lose the ability to communicate. And when our brain relives it, Zach, our brain doesn't understand the difference between real experience and imagined experience. And so when you're imagining it again, the language part of your brain is starved for oxygen. And so the best way to get people talking is to let the emotions come down again, let oxygen return to that area of the brain, and then the words will start flowing. They'll probably never be able to express. You can't express what your tours looked like or anything like that to somebody who wasn't there, because there's just not words for it.
I'm not a combat vet, so I
Okay.
don't, both of my deployments were into the Pacific. There was nothing going on, but it was, I was struggling with personal stuff, but I get what you're saying, like, it's, if you have that such an intense, like, high octane experience, like that same physiological response occurs when you're just
Yeah.
recalling it years and however long later. And that's,
Yep.
that's something I feel like therapy, I think, diminishes the residual effects of those things. Like every time that you do recall something, I think that in a similar manner, it kind of lessens the emotion that comes out the next time. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
kind of helps you be able to process it.
Yeah.
But it's, yeah, it's so fascinating. I feel like I could just sit and figure right on this stuff forever. And I figured this how this conversation would be, but I want to, I obviously you've already hinted at it. You do work with corporate clients and on communication and stuff, but tell everybody about the book and how that came about, and we can start to bring this thing to a close.
Yeah. So I wrote the book. It was published in 23 because I was doing corporate trainings already. I was teaching people better ways to communicate because if what I learned as a hostage negotiator works in high stress environments, like life and death situations, then your boardroom, it's going to work, right? It's like swinging the heavy bat before we get up to baseball. Like if this heavy bat is swingable, then when I get up there, the other bat feels lighter and I feel more confident with it. So I was already training this stuff, but then I figured not everybody can bring me into their organization to speak. I wanted this information to still get out there. And so I wrote the book called Silence Kills because my biggest pet peeve today, and we've hinted at it already, is when there's a crisis, especially in the workplace, the knee-jerk reaction is to shut down communication. If the media comes calling, it's no comment, or somebody comes into HR and says, well, I hear this is going on there. Like, we can't talk about that. I think when communication shuts down, things die. If you show me a married couple that are no longer speaking, the divorce is coming, right? If you can't talk about things, you can't fix them. And the problem in a corporate environment is if we don't talk about something, we don't kill the story, we just lose control of it. And so if it's an internal problem that nobody's talking about, but everybody feels it's going on, then our team members will start to find another place to work. If it's an external problem, we had a product fail, we had a service issue or something, and we won't talk to the public about it, then people will find another place to spend their money because they'll feel like you're hiding something. And actually, their brain doesn't like a narrative, so they'll come up with a reason for the silence that'll be way worse than what the actual problem is. The service recovery paradox is huge in the corporate world. It means I don't expect you to be perfect. I just expect you to be responsive and corrective when you're not perfect. And then I'll actually rate you higher because I feel like you were responsive than if you met all of my expectations. They studied this in the hotel industry. If I stay at your hotel, everything goes according to plan, I give you about a 7, right? You did your job. But if I had a problem while I was there, you became aware of it and you fixed my problem, I'll give you a 9 because that feels like a boutique type personalized experience, meaning it takes the pressure off. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be human and correct your errors. And that starts with communication. By standing up and saying, hey, we messed up, we're learning from it, and we're going to fix it moving forward because we want this to be the best place you've ever worked. That's the best way to deal with this in your team members. And I just, silence kills relationships, it kills businesses, and it can't be our knee-jerk response. That's why I wrote the book.
Yeah. Did you say that was called the service response paradox?
Service recovery paradox.
Recovery paradox. Okay.
Yes.
I was typing that in. I had a note of it and wanted to make sure I had it right. But
Yeah.
that's, I wonder how much of that, because like with the no comment thing, especially in a corporate environment like that, like from the outside looking in, when you see that stuff, you're like, or like that keeps up this facade that, okay, this corporate entity is just that. It is not a human. It is an entity.
Yes.
Whereas if you get the actual communication there and the willingness to change, like, yes, it reminds you, okay, there are people there. And that makes, so how's the book been doing?
It's been doing well. We're 3,000-ish copies, which most people, when they write a book, they sell about 60 copies, which is mom, dad, cousins, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So, largely moved through my speaking gigs. Like if I go to a big conference, a lot of times the organizers will buy the books for everybody in the room. So that's helpful. Corporations that I come to, we can negotiate the book into the fees so that when I leave, their team members all have the book for reference. And I'm actually working now more on a consulting basis instead of just coming in and training one time. Like, we'll work together for a year. I'll have office hours on Zoom with your team and come and ask questions. If they're going to have to bring in a client or a team member for a difficult conversation, they can reach out to me first. We can come up with a game plan. Because I find that coming in and speaking for an hour and a half has value, but partnering with organizations and working on a annual basis is much bigger bang for their buck. I come in, do the training, and then I'm a resource for them for the rest of the year.
Yeah, because I would imagine in an hour and a half, you're dumping a lot of knowledge on people. And then, they really like to really maximize what they get out of that. Like, they need to then
Yeah.
be able to bounce that information off of you to process what it is.
Yes. Yeah, there needs to be follow-up. And, last year I launched my own event, an in-person event called Story Distiller, because I teach through story, because that's how we remember things. And when you teach through story, you can drive culture, you can get buy-in from your clients and customers in a much bigger way when you can tell a good story. And so I host that event every year as well to try to teach people in 6 hours how to tell their story or their team's story in a better, more effective way.
And that kind of ties in. I've been wondering this whole time because you're obviously, this, you're a great communicator, and like, this has been an awesome conversation. Like, why'd you quit doing your podcast?
Because it was creating a lot of work for me. And I say that in a weird way. Like, I had to come up with new content every week. I did interviews for a lot of it, which I really enjoyed. I interviewed a lot of people that I didn't have any business having on my podcast, but it was fun to do that. But just the having to create content every week. What I do with my presentations that I do for corporations, it's about 80% tested and proven material, right? I know these stories work. I know these jokes kill, that kind of stuff. It's about 10 to 20% personalized for the audience. So I meet with the executives ahead of time. What are you struggling with? What can I reiterate that you've already told them? Because when the out-of-town expert says it, they hear it in a different way than when their boss has said it. So I can reiterate. But that, to me, that presentation gets better every time it's told. When I was doing podcasts, I would record a podcast and I'm like, that could have been so much better if I could say it 12 more times. And so I just didn't like that medium as far as coming up with new content all the time. Like I said, I'm much better connecting with people at podcasts like yours and serving your audience, because I can get on another podcast tomorrow, Zach, and say a lot of these same stories. They're not going to be the same way you brought them out of me because your style is different than somebody else's. But these are things that I know work, and I can take them to different audiences. When it was my podcast, it was the same audience all the time. And so the pressure to have new content every week or every other week was a lot. A lot of respect for my friends who are pastors, who are in front of the same audience week in, week out, and they got to have new stuff because Sunday's coming. A guy like me, I get to take the same stuff and make it better and better every time I say it.
Yeah, and you're like, damn, I'm good.
Well, sometimes. The times that I feel that way, Zach, when I step off a stage or in front of a boardroom, nobody comes and talks to me. The time that I feel like I blundered my way through this, people come up and they're like, that's exactly what I needed to hear. I'm like, I'm so glad, because I don't really know what I said.
That's so funny.
Yeah, it's just, when the more authentic you are, and I think that's in the AI-driven world, man, if we should strive for anything, it's to be authentic. And authentic means we make mistakes. And back to my earlier point, we own it when we do. Because AI, it's cool and it's a tool to be used, but it is also never going to replace humans when it comes to communication.
Yeah, I think that's something that is going to come out of this, regardless of, I see it because I'm a software developer. I think AI, at least in the way that it is promoted as being this solution for coding, we are so far off from it replacing software developers. And I think a lot of the content out there that does produce content that then says that it's like this awesome solution is probably AI generated or paid for kind of stuff, like, under the table. But like, regardless of what jobs this replaces, whatever content, AI can make songs, but we're never going to appreciate that the same as we appreciate something that Jelly Roll wrote or, Metallica put out, and we know that they made. And I do think that will be reinforced over the coming years as AI does get better and better.
Yeah.
And It's
And there was a part of me as I got in the speaking world that felt bad saying the same stories every place I went. But then I thought, with your example, if I go to a Metallica concert, if they don't play Inner Sandman, I'm mad. Right? For them, it's the millionth time they've played it. Like, they can play it without even thinking about it. It feels old hat to them, but to the audience, that's what they came to hear. And so when I tell this story, even in front of the same audience more than once, if I come back a couple years later, that's what they remember and that's what they want to hear again. So we watch our favorite movie 50 times until we can quote it because we just love it. It resonates with us and we're not mad that it's the same this time when we hit play.
That is so, I never would have thought of that for a speech, but that makes so much sense when you say it like that.
Yeah.
Which that's probably like the 12th iteration of me saying that was something that you've said where I'm like, wow, that makes so much sense. But so I apologize for that. And
Don't. It's all good.
Where can people find you? Obviously the book, they can Google Scott Harvey, Silence Kills, but where can they find you to speak and get all this other good stuff?
Yeah, the book is on Amazon. It's also on online booksellers like Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, that type of stuff. The website is speakingofharvey.com, and there's all the information on there, what it looks like to have me come as a consultant or to come and speak. And all of that stuff is on there. At the bottom, there's also keys to my socials. You can connect with me online. I'm always on the social media. For an extrovert like me. It's just my crack. Like it's
Okay.
all the people that I'm waiting to connect with and learn from.
Awesome. What else? You got anything else?
I think that's it, man. I'm honored to serve you and your audience. And if I can do anything else in the future, just let me know.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for taking the time, man. I mean, I love this conversation. So thanks.
You're welcome.
And thanks everyone at home for listening to another episode of Going In Blind. Please remember to rate and review the show wherever you listen, and then share this thing around with someone who needs to hear it. There was a lot to take away from this conversation, as there is every week, and we'll see you next time.